So welcome to Greenlink's virtual open house event about the Human Trafficking Awareness Grant. To get you all caught up to speed, Greenlink applied for a Human Trafficking Awareness Grant through the Federal Transit Administration in 2019. We were awarded funds by the Federal Transit Administration in January of 2020, and then in the spring of 2020, we met with our partners to talk about the timeline for the grant and the deliverables. And our partners on this initiative include Switch, Jasmine Road, Bon Secours, and Greenville County's Sheriff's Office. So you may recall that we kicked off our campaign in September of 2020. And in September, we launched a month-long survey to the general public for us to get an idea about the level of knowledge and the level of awareness that the general public has on topics related to human trafficking. So what are misconceptions that exist around human trafficking, or what is it that the general public already knows and understands? So that survey closed on October 11th, and we really used that data to set a baseline for us. We'd like to do the same survey at the end of this campaign to see if general awareness and understanding increased after all of the trainings and initiatives that Greenlink plans to undertake in the next 18 months. This kickoff phase also includes open house charettes, which is what you're tuning into right now. The purpose of these open house events are to relay back the survey's findings so that you understand what those facts and misconceptions about human trafficking are, and then also to get your input on next steps. Moving forward, Greenlink plans to host at least 3 public trainings around human trafficking. These trainings will be for members of the public, but will also coincide with 3 private trainings for Greenlink's drivers, dispatchers, and supervisors to know the red flags about human trafficking and know how to react when they spot human trafficking happening. These 3 trainings are scheduled to take place in December of 2020, in April of 2021, and in August of 2021. So they'll be spaced out to give individuals time to register, make plans to attend those trainings, and then allow time for those training materials to sink in. We received a lot of comments on the survey from individuals who are passionate and looking for opportunities to learn more on this topic. And these trainings will allow the opportunity to do just that. It'll be that option for individuals who are looking to gain a more in-depth knowledge about human trafficking and have a better understanding about what to do when they spot human trafficking. Since the grant also included an effort to address public safety concerns as a whole, we also plan to host 2 roundtables where we include members of law enforcement and members of the public, especially Greenlink's riders, to talk about overall safety concerns that extend further than just human trafficking, but address any type of safety or crime or concern that they are addressing or encountering on the buses. The last phase of the grant will include a large public awareness event in January of 2022, which will coincide with National Human Trafficking Awareness Month. That public awareness event will be a culmination of all of the trainings that have been received and provided thus far in the campaign, and we'll reissue the same survey in order to measure how much information has really been absorbed by our community. Greenlink also plans to produce a video that will recap the 3 driver trainings and provide a sustainable way for anybody who's new to Greenlink staff to receive that same information moving forward. This will ensure that these trainings are sustainable and that any new employee has that same opportunity to learn about human trafficking and know what and how to report. Lastly, I would like to remind people what the grant is actually paying for. Grant funds will be used to cover drivers' hourly salary wages while they're attending the trainings. This helps us ensure that driver participation will be at a high level because drivers will end their typical 8-hour shift and be able to stay at Greenlink's office in order to receive that important training. We'll also use grant funds to pay for the printing of the advertising materials that will go on the outsides of buses, inside the buses, and at the bus stop shelters. We'll also use grant funds to pay for that new employee orientation video production. So we do have to have that video produced so that it's there and available for new employee orientations. And then lastly, we intended to use some of the funds to pay for snacks and lunches for members of the public while they're receiving the trainings. But due to COVID, we will be exploring other options other than food, especially if we move to virtual opportunities as a thank you for those individuals who participate in our training events. So I would like to thank the 171 individuals who took time out of their day to take our human trafficking survey. This is an important first step for us to know what type of knowledge and perceptions exist around human trafficking before we get started down this long road ahead of us. Up next in this virtual open house event, you'll hear directly from the experts as they go over the correct and incorrect responses on the survey, as well as share some real life examples of what's going on in Greenville County as it relates to human trafficking.
Human trafficking means bringing people from other countries into the United States, or at least involves some form of travel or transportation. The correct answer is false.
I think it's a common misconception when you hear the word trafficking that you think that there's movement from place to place. The federal definition of trafficking involves force, fraud, and coercion. Force, I made you do it. Fraud, I tricked you into doing it. And coercion involves some type of manipulation. So that does not necessarily mean that a trafficked person is moving place to place. You could be trafficked from the home next door. But that's not also to say that that does not happen, that victims are moved. At Jasmine Road, we've had women that have been moved from city to city and moved from state to state. So that could possibly be a part of human trafficking, but it's not necessarily the case.
Boys and men can be human trafficking victims. The correct answer is true.
So human trafficking is no respecter of persons. I think it's a common misconception that only women are being trafficked. But trafficking can happen to women, to men, to boys and girls. It's no respecter of race or origin or age even. And I've had the opportunity to work with a male trafficking victim that was trafficked from South Carolina and wound up in California. So it is happening to all different types of people.
A human trafficking victim might be free to go places, may appear happy, and may even appear to solicit customers on their own. The correct answer is true.
So many times a human trafficking victim really thinks that they're in a relationship with their trafficker, or perhaps this is a business agreement that they are just working together to make some money. But the reality is that traffickers are smart and that they are manipulating people into doing things that they want them to do. And I think that makes it really hard in many cases, even for law enforcement, to identify a trafficking victim, because they may think that this person is just prostituting. So I believe there's a fine line between trafficking and prostitution. And one of the things that we always say at Jasmine Road is prostitution is the choice for those with the fewest choices. So a lot of the people involved in human trafficking many times are doing this for their survival because they fear the trafficker or fear repercussions if they don't do what they're told to do. I think it's hard to wrap your mind around that human trafficking really is happening right here in Greenville. And it is a problem, it's a big problem. We at Jasmine Road, we opened our doors in May of 2018 and we serve 5 women. We've had over 100 applications since we've been open in the past 2 years. So that shows you what a problem that it is. And there's not very many services for human trafficking victims. Jasmine Road is the only place in the state that is a long-term restoration program for adult survivors of human trafficking, prostitution, and addiction. One of the things that we see at Jasmine Road is trafficking and prostitution go hand in hand with addiction. So 100% of the women that we serve have some sort of addiction issue. And to really wrap your mind around the scope of this problem, a human trafficking victim and many of the women that have come into our program will tell you that human trafficking was not the worst thing that happened to them. So in many cases, they've come from traumatic backgrounds, and they have a plethora of issues. They might be a victim of domestic violence, also a victim of multiple sexual assaults. And we have to begin to heal this whole total person and help them launch back into the community as a productive member. So the way we do that at Jasmine Road, we provide a 2-year long-term restoration program, and the women come and stay, and they learn new life skills, and they learn about relationships, because what we have seen with human trafficking is many times the trafficker gets close to a woman through building a relationship, because these women have no frame of reference of what a healthy relationship looks like. So that's a lot of where the manipulation and control comes in, when they come and pose as someone that loves them or is taking care of them or providing things for them. In many cases, these women have not been provided the things that they needed when they were young children, and they become very vulnerable to human trafficking. Traffickers prey on weaknesses. I believe it's a coward's crime. They're looking for people that display weaknesses, and if they can't find a weakness, then they're going to try to create one. And again, that's where that manipulation comes in. So this is a big problem that is happening in our community.
A person who agrees to engage in prostitution can still be a victim of human trafficking. The correct answer is true.
One of the common misunderstandings is that somebody who has prostituted in the past or has agreed to prostitute can't be the victim of human trafficking. And the answer is actually that they can be. Someone can agree to prostitute right up until the point that they don't want to anymore. And as soon as someone forces them to do an act that they don't want to do, they become a victim of human trafficking. No one can tell another person what they can and can't do.
Human traffickers often promise victims a better life and may begin by showering them with love, affection, or attention. The correct answer is true.
In the law, human trafficking is defined as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to force someone into either work or sex trafficking. And we often key on force. So we think of a victim being someone who is beaten or kidnapped or imprisoned. But often what we see is far more devious. It's a psychological manipulation in which someone is promised something in terms of a fraud. They're offered something better, or they're coerced, they're tricked, they're blackmailed into doing something that they don't want to do. Often it's a boyfriend or a girlfriend who says, I really love you, but I just need this one thing. We need money to live the life we want to live, or we have to have this to do what we want to do. And it's a subtle, sometimes, but a very, very devious thing, because it's actually worse than an overt violent act, because it's manipulating the person into thinking that they're doing something they want to do, when in fact they're only doing something that you want them to do. And so when we look for this, we aren't just looking for force. We're not just looking for bruises or signs of abuse. We're looking for levels of control. We're looking for someone who has an inordinate amount of control over another human being. Now that could be domestic violence or a child abuse. It could be some other things, but that level of control is not normal in a normal, healthy relationship. A lot of times people will come to us and they'll say, I saw something, it seemed unusual, I didn't know what it was, but I didn't know who to report it to. And one of the important things to know is that if you see something that looks abnormal, it's like any other crime. If you see something that doesn't quite sit right or you're not 100% sure of, feel free to call your local law enforcement. In this case, call the Greenville County Sheriff's Office. Call the municipality that you live in, or whatever law enforcement you have. Call SLED if you're a resident of South Carolina. Any of those agencies know how to investigate a crime, and they know how to route those complaints or those tips to other people. You don't know where what you might see may be very important to another investigation, or perhaps you are seeing something that is criminal and needs to be followed up with. The worst thing we can do in any situation is just to keep our mouth quiet, our mouth shut, and not say anything at all. The most important thing we can do is report crimes or report things like that. Another common misunderstanding is that people think these are our trafficking victims that we find in the upstate of South Carolina are from other places. Maybe they come from Atlanta, or maybe they come from Charlotte, or maybe they come from outside of the United States. Many people are still stuck on the idea that trafficking victims can only be Hispanic, or they can only be in an Asian massage parlor. But the truth is, one of the most dangerous trends we're seeing recently is that our trafficking victims are often our own homegrown kids. And so we're seeing more and more children from the upstate of South Carolina that are being trafficked in and around South Carolina. And that is something that we need to get under control. So if you see something, if you hear something, if something just doesn't set right with you, notify your local law enforcement agency and allow them to follow up.
A 16-year-old who willingly works for a pimp who does not use force, fraud, or coercion is a child prostitute and cannot be considered a victim of human trafficking. The correct answer is false.
By legal definition, anyone who is under the age of 18 cannot consent to the commercial sex industry. So anytime that we find a minor who is in the commercial sex industry, they are immediately considered a human trafficking victim.
Human trafficking victims are always poor and uneducated. The correct answer is false.
Human trafficking victims are often from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, all sort of demographics. And what we really see is that we see some victims who they may come from poor backgrounds that are disenfranchised, and then other times we are meeting women who come from, very well-off families who maybe even are in college now and they're looking for a way to pay their tuition or find some side money. What we really try to explain is that trafficking is more about vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities can be anything. It doesn't have to be money. It could often even just be looking for someone to give you attention or a way to, feel appreciated or cared for or valued. So it doesn't always have to be a low income situation, and often we find that people who come from different backgrounds and higher education or higher backgrounds also are victims of trafficking.
Pimp-controlled prostitution is a form of human trafficking. The correct answer is true.
Pimp control is definitely a form of human trafficking, and we actually have seen a variety of types of pimps even within that. I think many of you may be thinking immediately of the more dangerous, violent pimp, the ones that are going to be more forceful or physically violent, and that definitely is true. We see that often, but also there is such a thing as a Romeo pimp, and that person is more than likely going to use psychological coercion and try to lure them in with gifts and false promises, and maybe even seem like a boyfriend or a best friend, trying to recruit them with something that actually isn't substantial and really isn't a real relationship. And so really we see all different kinds of pimping when it comes to pimp control, but pimp control is a type of human trafficking. Switch was founded in 2012, and we've served over 375 women with a variety of different backgrounds and cases. But the reality is that's probably even just scratching the surface of what we've seen. We know that there are many cases, including the women we work with every day, who will not report to law enforcement due to fear or uncertainty of whether they're safe or not. Often traffickers actually use the fear of law enforcement as a way for women not to get help. We also know that often trafficking victims do not self-identify and recognize themselves as a trafficking victim. And part of the reason that happens is because of our media and our culture and the way that we talk about these issues. Often we know that women and men who are in this industry are not just choosing that lifestyle, it's due to force or fraud or coercion. And we know that they are actually becoming victims of trafficking, but because society has said, oh, that must be a choice lifestyle and you're making lots of money, a lot of times we've not been safe for people to come and self-identify and get the help that they need.
A person cannot be considered a human trafficking victim unless there is evidence of physical violence or kidnapping. The correct answer is false.
Why I think this is so important is because human trafficking is such a large problem that it's nothing that one single industry can solve. Police department can't do it by itself. The hospital systems can't do it by themselves. It's a community problem that takes a community effort. So awareness is always the key point where we begin any conversation. So the fact that people believe that people are being coerced is really interesting, because what we see a lot in the hospital when we get people through the emergency rooms and through our healthcare providers is that there's multiple reasons why people find themselves in the situation they are. Sometimes it's blackmail situations, often over immigration status or perhaps some embarrassment that done through Facebook. Often we find manipulation in the fact that loved ones are taken away from them or threaten them. Often it's pharmaceutical intervention, they're hooked on a narcotic or something. But the one thing that's for sure is there's a circumstance behind the position why people are trafficked. Of course, if the person is under 18 and a child, children cannot consent to to anything, but they particularly cannot consent to going into an industry where they're abused and used and treated for gratification, and usually that of a sexual nature. What I think is really interesting is, as the awareness factor becomes more prevalent and people become more attuned to this horrible crime in our community, is when people are rescued, what's the next step? So I think healthcare professionals and certainly healthcare providers are more in tune to the plight of human suffering. And now with the vast body of primarily women that were being rescued, how do we bring them to full restoration? Well, again, we believe that that's best done in collaboration with community partners. And coming up very shortly, we'll be making a fairly big announcement that I can give you an indication. It's in partnership with our community partners, Jasmine Road. It's through funding we received through our system office and matched it with community funding from other faith-based hospitals in our community and certainly faith-based churches that said, listen, we understand what you're doing is good, and together we want to make a difference. And this next phase will involve not only restoration of the ladies, but helping them to teach them some life skills and coaching skills, and also giving them an opportunity to reintegrate through a protected network back into the community. And that's ultimately what it's all about. It takes about 2 years to convince a woman that a man who said he loved her but sold her 20 times a night for sex didn't really love her. And once we get over that obstacles and we start to rebuild their self-esteem and sense of self-worth, that's when the community comes together and we bring restoration, healing, and hope.
A person who is paid for their work in the commercial sex industry cannot be considered a victim of human trafficking. The correct answer is false.
One of the things that we're told in healthcare when looking to be able to recognize signs of victims of trafficking is that victims will hardly ever identify as a victim. And that's because some don't even realize that they are a victim. To them, it seems like because of all of this manipulation that's happened, all the grooming, that it may even seem like a choice to them. They may be soliciting their own customers. They may be receiving money that doesn't all go to their pimp. They may be making their own money off of their prostitution, and most don't even realize that they're being victimized. So it is possible for victims to solicit their own customers, to make their own money, and still be considered a victim.
Human trafficking victims always immediately identify themselves as victims to potential rescuers and are desperate to escape. The correct answer is false.
So victims won't typically be asking for help or identify as a victim right away. It could be frightened for a number of reasons, maybe because of their immigration status, or had difficult situations with law enforcement in the past, and don't trust our law enforcement to be able to help them get out of the situation. Many may even feel like they put themselves into this own situation, feel a lot of guilt for choices that they may have made that eventually led sort of to this path to being victimized and being exploited. So that guilt and shame might prevent people from asking for help right away. And some even maybe because of their backgrounds, the life that they've lived previously, trauma that they've experienced in the past, being trafficked might not be the worst thing that's ever happened to them. This life may be better than the life that they came from. So getting out of it is not necessarily the first thought that's coming to their mind.
The final step in this virtual open house event is to hear from you. You've heard from our experts about the facts and misconceptions about human trafficking, and now we need to know your ideas. First off, we'd like to know what advertising messages Greenlink needs to be putting out there about human trafficking awareness. We plan to put ads inside the buses, on the outside of buses, and in bus stop shelters, but we'd like to hear ideas about what those ads should say. What do our riders need to see and hear in order to have a greater awareness about human trafficking? The second thing we'd like to hear from you all is what types of trainings do we need to cover to make sure that awareness is being increased about human trafficking? What types of topics do you want to learn about as members of the public regarding human trafficking? And then lastly, given the COVID-19 pandemic, how can we best facilitate those trainings for you? Would you be open to in-person trainings in the Greenlink Transit Center? Would you like to see recorded videos to have trainings available on these topics? Or would you like to tune into live streaming webinar style events? So this is your chance. At the bottom of this video, there is a link to a survey to give us those ideas about advertising messages, give us those ideas about the training topics you really want to learn about, and give us your ideas about how to best facilitate those trainings to make sure that the message on human trafficking and human trafficking awareness is reaching our public. Thank you.